So if you come up with ideas, the ideas have got to be, as far as possible, congruent with embryology and congruent with evolutionary biology. Otherwise, it's just whistling in the wind. So, for example, when when your limb buds are forming, your limb buds form on a very enigmatic structure. It's only there in the embryo for a few days, encircles the whole embryo. It's called the Wolffian ridge. Your arms and legs form on this ridge. As the lower limb forms, it goes through a profound internal twist so that the front of the leg, the quadriceps, is derived from your back body, and your hamstrings are derived from your front body. So if you just try and run lines directly down the front of the body and then down the quads, you're without showing that there's been a profound twist there, it's just wrong. There's no other ways of doing it. So you've got to use embryology, and you've got to use those insights and try and, in a way, work out how to model this stuff. Contractile fields are it's a beautiful model. I still think, I published this in 2010, Muscles and Meridians, a book. I think it's still the best model there is out there. It's the only model of human movement that is whole organism in scope, meaning every field I describe has to go from your sensory platform down to your pelvic floor. In a sense, cranial nerve 1, the nose, leads the whole game, and it has done in vertebrates for the last 500 million years. And then your feet aren't the bottom of you, your pelvic floor is. So every field, like a magnet, has to go from the north to the south. So from the sensory platform down to the pelvic floor.
FC2O. From chaos to order. From chaos to order. Here we go. From chaos to order. From chaos to order. FC2O.
Today, I'm excited to share with you my friend, colleague and mentor, the deeply insightful Phill Beach. Now, Phill is an osteopath and acupuncturist based in Wellington, New Zealand. There's someone I could listen to all day. As you'll hear, Phill is highly creative, original, and epitomises what it is to be a truly free thinker. A huge influence on my career, Phill was the first person to guide me to see the value in developing models to help simplify the vast complexity of human function. We'll see its roots in Phil's own Contractile Fields model. Working with Phill allowed me to immediately recognise the value in Paul Chek's similar free-thinking ability to develop clinically applied models, allowing people to move towards realising their potential. Here we journey through Phil's early life and career to understand what influences directed his thinking, diving into his models of archetypal rest postures, decoding the Meridial Map, contractile fields, and his clever use of analogy and metaphor to help us recognise simplicity on the other side of complexity. I'm sure you'll enjoy taking this journey with us, and will emerge the other end with deeper insights and new ideas as to how the human being has evolved to function. Enjoy the show. Here we go. Welcome to another edition of FC2O with me, Matt Wallden, and my guest today, Phill Beach. Welcome, Phill.
Thank you, Matt. A pleasure to be with you.
Excellent. Okay, fantastic. So now I'm going to do a little introduction because, of course, actually in my preview to the podcast series, I mentioned you and I mentioned your archetypal postures, which we're going to get to later. But you've been one of my biggest sort of inspirations in my career. As a student, I was very enamored with the information you're presenting and the way you're presenting it. It really just captured my imagination. And, a lot of that, of course, is because of the way you wrap it up in the embryology and the evolutionary biology and so on. So I'm going to ask you a bit about that as we go through. But I think also because your take was so unique. And so what I wanted to do was get a sense of your background leading into your career and, see if that sheds any light on or shines any light on how you ended up with the approach that you have. So Phill, tell us a little bit about your childhood and how you ended up in London at the osteopathic college training there.
Okay, Matt, this sounds like taking a case history.
Yeah, exactly. And tell us about the aggravating and relieving factors.
My father was a banker, and he set up banks in developing countries.
Right.
So I was born in Sydney, but every 3 years we'd head off for another 3-year stint somewhere else. So we lived in Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, and Nigeria.
Right.
And so 3 years on, 3 years off. And I guess that shaped the way I view the world. And then I was interested as a teenager in biology. Just gradually, I realized that studying osteopathy would be a good thing for me. So I left Sydney and traveled to London in 1979 to study at the British College of Osteopathic Medicine.
Yeah. And was that on your own, or did any family members come with you?
No, that was on my own. That was
yeah.
Taking off. It's great. I loved the college in those days. It was small, cranky, quirky, but a good education.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. And so what age were you when you made that trip?
I think I was about 19.
So you studied pretty early on, and then what year did you graduate then?
In 83.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And so then I know you've trained in acupuncture as well, which obviously leads into some of the models and theories that you've developed. But when did that occur in your career? So had you been practicing for a little while before you studied acupuncture?
I practiced for a couple of years, and then I went back and started doing some teaching with Philip Tanswell. And that went on for a few years, and then it was about 87, I guess. I started studying acupuncture and graduated in 1990, 91, somewhere in that time frame.
Right.
So I wanted a different cultural perspective. I didn't know much about acupuncture. In fact, nobody in the early 90s knew much. There was only 1 or 2 schools in Europe. It was all we knew. I wanted a different cultural perspective, and I certainly got that.
Yes, absolutely. And so how did that influence your thinking from an osteopathic perspective?
Well, in the beginning, and for quite some years, when you study acupuncture, particularly in those days, it was done entirely by rote. You were presented this 500-page book that described the meridians and all the extra meridians and the points on the meridians, and the way this line links to that line. So, and there's no external validation for this at all. Which is quite a strange thing to study, really. It's like faith medicine in a way. It's like having a large table with 600 colored Smarties, and every color does a different disease.
Yes, right.
Well, how are you linking color to pathology? So anyway, you study because you want to pass your exams, and you have to trust that the Chinese 2,000 years ago were mapping something.
Yes, yeah.
And then gradually, as I was developing my contractile field model, I had a couple of these aha moments when I started to see what I think the Chinese were trying to do with their map. And I would suggest that meridians are largely a map of manual therapy.
Right.
Which is why it's very useful for any manual therapist, or particularly osteopathy.
Yeah, fantastic. And I know in the early days, I believe you were talking more about the concept of muscle chains, but you changed that kind of terminology to contractile fields at a certain point. And does that describe better, or does it interact better with the acupuncture observations that you made?
No, I was moving towards the field theory before I sat down. It took me about 6 months to reverse engineer the map once I realized what they were trying to do.
Right.
And but so I was thinking along the idea of fields. I realized that lines, if you could reduce something as complicated as the human body down to a few lines,
Yeah,
anatomy trains, that sort of thing, every culture would have done it hundreds,
sure,
if not
sure.
thousands of years ago. It's everything we know about fascia and human movement. It's lines is inadequate.
Mm, mm,
So I started to move towards this idea of fields. And
mm,
one night I was sitting there trying to see how I could model, how I could understand limbs in my
mm,
model. And I was looking at a picture of an embryonic limb bud, and suddenly I saw it. The limb
mm.
bud was at about 28 days, and it was showing uh, like a little paddle coming out of the side of the embryo.
Yeah.
And it had a preaxial border, which is the top of the paddle, a postaxial border at the bottom of the paddle, and
Mm,
lines in the middle, front, and back. And that's when I started to see that embryologists were describing something that was very similar to what the Chinese were doing with their meridians.
right. So these are essentially axes down the limbs, right?
Well, the ventral axis in the middle and the
Mm,
dorsal axis in the middle, yes, they're axes. At the
right.
top and the bottom, they're called borders. A border
Right.
between ventral and dorsal, or you could say a border between yin and yang, same
Mm,
type of idea.
mm-hmm.
And to control the border, you need to place lines of control on either side of the border.
Mm,
I read a paper a few years before about called border control in cellular walls.
mm,
It's all about how complicated cell walls are, and you control in and out of a cell wall through a bilaminar membrane.
yeah.
So something's got to get through the first layer of the cell wall into this very complicated nether world in the middle, and then it's either accepted and brought in through the next layer, or it's
Mm,
turned out.
yeah.
And it's analogous in a way to the steering wheel of your car. If you're
Mm-hmm.
driving, it's best to have a line on to place your hands at, say, 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's not right. Two
No.
o'clock and 10 o'clock. 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. Yeah, yeah. I was going to say, could be an interesting journey.
So you've got a border in the middle there, and it's no
Yeah.
good just if you want to control that border. It's no good putting your hand just on the top of the steering wheel,
Mm,
because as you drive along, you'll veer to the left and to the right.
mm,
You'll weave.
yeah, yeah.
Drives people mad behind you.
Mm,
So I started to see that at all levels of biology and politics, and everywhere you see a border, the best way to control a border is to put these lines of control on the dorsal and the ventral side of the border. And
yeah, yeah. Right.
suddenly I started to see that the Chinese had been very, very perceptive in rooting out where these borders are on the human body and
Mm.
placing lines of control on them.
And I remember you relating this at one point to this kind of exquisite observation of human control through the martial arts. Is that right? Is something along those lines, that the way that, for example, in Aikido or other martial arts, there's certain points on the body which, if you twist or grab or strike, it has an effect, a kind of predictable effect on the body. And am I right in thinking that you were saying that sort of level of observation and practical application relates very closely to these lines you're describing?
Absolutely. It's the Chinese, when they were doing this 2,000 years ago,
Mm.
uh, obsessed with borders, because the Genghis Khan and his group was coming down and causing mayhem. So they
Yeah.
started building the early forms, the prototypes of their Great Wall of China.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So they were very concerned about inside and outsides,
Mm-hmm.
and they'd been through, and they were towards the end of what's called the Warring State period, and this
Right.
is 400 years of almost continuous warfare,
Mm.
as they went from 60 or 80 states down to one state. It was a time of generations of horrendous fighting. But out of
Right.
it was a very creative period for their philosophy, obviously for their medicine, because there were a lot of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
and then a lot of martial arts, because that's you win by being the best fighter.
Yeah. Sure. Sure.
And so all of that played into, I think, into the development of this map.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually think I've come closer to, I call it a translatory model. The Chinese did what they did 2,000 years ago. We largely learn that by rote now. And then there's
Mm-hmm.
the modern world where we like to see reasons or rationale for it. And
Yes.
so there needs to be a translatory model between those domains. And I suspect that contractile fields and this model of lines of control goes a long way to showing what the Chinese Meridial Map is all about.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. So at what point did the archetypal rest postures sort of start to form in your mind as part of the system of balancing the body? Because this is another key model that you developed and taught me at college, and then obviously I taught alongside you for a while. And that archetypal postures concept, did that come to you around the same time, or was it before or during this kind of period of developing your ideas around the meridial map?
It was before that. And I've been
Mm-hmm.
conscious that a posture like the full squat is a very important human posture.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I didn't really know why in the beginning. I just thought that if you're going to test someone by standing behind them and watching them forward bend or backward bend, you might as well get them to squat as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew the squat was important, possibly because I grew up in all these third world countries.
Yeah.
And I'd spent a lot of time squatting with my friends in the backyard.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Um, so that idea started earlier, but then it takes time for these ideas to sort of morph into a coherent strategy or insight.
Mm.
Uh,
Mm.
I so out of that and some years of gradually refining my ideas came what I now call archetypal postures.
Mm.
A bit tongue in cheek, the opposite of sitting on the floor is the getting up and down from the floor. I call those the erect exercises.
Yes, yeah, and does that link into Homo erectus, or is it just purely the fact that you are getting up to stand erect?
It's both.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
could have called them the floor to standing transition exercises,
Mm.
but that doesn't have much
Doesn't have
wow.
a ring to
Yeah.
it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so most research coming out now says that Homo erectus was in our family tree, if not a direct ancestor.
Yeah.
And this something about standing up changed the whole game with us,
Mm.
because the standing up came before the big brains, before the fire, before the language, and before the tools.
Yes, yes.
So we were basically a pretty primitive chimpanzee type animal,
Mm.
and because we started to become bipedal, full-time bipedal animals, a cascade of change was initiated.
Mm. Mm. Fantastic. So,
And the flip side of being on the floor is getting up from the floor, and that's we are derived from Homo erectus. That's what we did. We stood up.
yeah, and so just to give people a kind of mental image of what we're talking about here. So we've obviously mentioned the deep squats, and then getting up, but you've got specific, first of all, other archetypal postures that you talk about, but also specific ways of getting up as well. So do you want to sort of give a little bit of an overview?
Sure. Um, I call them archetypal because I think they're common to all mankind,
Mm-hmm.
men, women, cultures all around the world, young baby, well, not babies, but from infants right through to old age, and going back in our evolutionary history as well. So
Mm-hmm.
every animal, when it's not moving, needs to rest. You
Yeah.
can't have rest without movement. You can't have systolic without diastolic. Your blood pressure, for example. The rest is really important, and all animals have particular forms of resting. And for humans, it's predictable. You either lie down on your front, your back, or your side, and that's on the ground, so it's a fairly firm surface. Or you do full squats, or all the other form of like the more linear looking postures, which is long sitting with your legs in front of you, or sitting on your knees and toes, or sitting on your shin bones like the Japanese do, those more linear looking postures. Or, and just as importantly, you can start turning your legs out or in. So now you do all the cross-legged type postures.
Yeah.
There's quite a few variants on that. So I think the human physique, to be in good form, and because we're bipedal, we're rather specialized, these postures help tune your physique. I think it's really important that we let kids grow up with less access to chairs, more access to the floor, and for longer, so that as they, when teenagers are developing, as they're going through their growth spurts, as they're starting to put on muscle, all that type of thing, their system is fine-tuned by regular access to squatting and the more linear postures and the more turned out postures.
Yeah, because in your home you don't have chairs, do you? Have you got any chairs? I know in your living room you don't have a sofa or an armchair.
No, they're bad. We have a bench,
right,
that you can sit on if you need to. Some people aren't comfortable on the floor, and if people are coming for dinner, you've got to give them something.
Yeah.
So there's a hard bench that you can sit on.
Yeah.
But
okay.
Just by getting rid of your chairs, I would urge people to, when it's socially acceptable, to, if you want to age well, if you want to load the biomechanical dice in your favor, so more likely to get to 80s and still be in reasonable form, get rid of your furniture whenever it's socially acceptable and return to the floor. And the flip side of that is you've got to stand up on the floor.
Yes.
So you're getting both. You're getting this. Getting up from the floor is a profound movement sequence. Totally different to getting in and out of a chair.
Yeah. It's and that's why it takes so long for a child to get to the point that it can stand up. If you take the baby that's just been born, it takes close to a year for them to be able to stand up, because it's a very complex movement pattern which requires all kinds of stabilization and coordination to do that, right?
You've got the big heavy head right at the top of the wobbly system.
Yes, yeah.
On two little bases of support, it's really quite ludicrous.
It is. But, tying in with this, I think I might have sent you the report, but I think it was maybe 2 years ago, roughly, that there was a report that came out which was looking at a key predictor of longevity. And it was the ability of an individual to get up from the floor without using their hands had I think it had one of the strongest statistically significant kind of indications that you would live for longer. And if you had to use a hand to get up, then your chances of surviving dropped right down. So I thought that was just a fascinating kind of supportive piece of evidence for your erectorcises concept.
Totally.
Yeah.
Very strong predictor.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic.
The Brazilian study published in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology.
Right. Okay, so you got the study. Excellent. And so can you tell us anything more about these erectorcises? So some of them sort of more lunge-like, and some of them more squat-like. And I mean, what are the different variations?
I'm not that keen on lunges.
Yeah,
I think that's lunges in a way come out of our reductionist approach to understanding muscles and movement.
Mm-hmm.
So a deep lunge is a way of targeting your quads.
Yeah.
And if I saw a Stone Age man lunge across a small stream and then get back, and then lunge across again and get back, and lunge across the stream and get back, I would think he's gone crazy.
Nuts.
All these say, what's happened?
Yeah.
I can see putting a weight on your shoulders and walking up a hill and stepping over things, but moving on. I see that as a more lifelike, valid exercise. I see people in bad mechanical condition and they go into a boot camp, they do too many lunges, and once you upset those knees, they can be upset for a long, long time.
Yeah, definitely. So how have you seen these things applied in clinic? I know you've used them for many, many years now, and I know you've told me some stories of people that have just had really quite, I think what many people think quite miraculous turnarounds in their biomechanical health from using archetypal rest postures and these exercises. Can you give one or two sort of examples of that kind of thing that you've seen?
I'm through the exercises and archetypal postures, I'm interested in your biomechanical tune.
Yes.
I think these postures, including now the ideas I've got about brachiation and hanging, these postures are so deeply embedded in your system. They're directly analogous to 120 on 80 for your blood pressure, or 20 vision, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So by taking people towards ease in these postures, you're tuning them towards these deeply embedded norms. When you're in better tune, you're less likely to hurt yourself.
Yeah.
And if you do hurt yourself, you're more likely to get over it. Whereas in my opinion, if you're getting tight and maybe strong but tight, and then you hurt yourself, the injuries go deeper. They take longer to repair.
So I remember you telling me about a patient of yours that was a CrossFitter and they could squat deep, but only when they're holding their kettlebell or their barbell or whatever. And that's not the kind of tuning you're talking about, right?
No, that's an external help. Full squat. There's a nice book out called Lowly Origin, which is about the evolution of humans in East Africa. And this guy calls the book Lowly Origin. His name's Kingdon. I think it's Jonathan Kingdon. And he suggests that he calls the book Lowly Origin because he thinks the whole game started with an ape that started to come out of the trees for longer periods of time. And it started with an ape that could squat.
Right.
A full squat, freeing the hands up. That way you've got two hands. With two hands, that opens up the possibility of sign language. It opens up feeding faster, all that sort of thing. Possibly.
Yeah.
So it goes from squatting to standing to walking to running. That's the he sees.
Yeah.
Quite persuasive idea when you read the whole book.
Yeah, makes sense.
So in this idea of tuning, I think that you've got two main. If you're trying to tune a Steinway piano, you'd go to middle C, you get middle C sounding good, and then you start to go up and down through the octaves. So I would say we're like a bimodal thing. We've got a key tuning point around middle C, which is the full squat, and another one around being at ease in cross-legged. And a lot of people I meet prefer one over the other.
Yeah.
People that can't squat like to sit cross-legged, or vice versa. Whereas in the ideal world, you've got access to both.
Yeah.
So, and we're all genetically different. Hips vary quite a lot. But I think that in a more normal lifestyle where you're barefoot as you're forming, as you're learning to walk, run, jump, that sort of thing, you would tune your system towards the best that your genetics could give you.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
now we're letting our genetics, we're not inhibiting, we're not attenuating what you've been given from your ancestors.
So this is like the tuning concept is like a kind of homeostasis for the musculoskeletal system.
Absolutely, yeah. Just help pull you back into. I'm sitting here in front of this computer cross-legged. But if I was outside in the New Zealand winter, cold, wet, muddy, I think I'd be trying to squat.
Yeah, right.
Or I'd be sitting Japanese style so that I'm only putting my shin bone into the cold, wet mud.
Yeah, I remember Michael Tetley, and Michael Tetley was the guy that wrote the Instinctive Sleep Postures paper, which had some similarities with your concepts. But he talked about that posture as being used by, who was it? I think I don't know, something like Siberian gypsies to sleep. So they would kneel down, and his explanation was that, if you've just got the shin contacting the ground, then you just literally are contacting the ground with bone, and you're not letting your soft tissues get too cold. I thought that was quite an interesting insight.
Tibetan porters sleep like that.
Tibetan porters, maybe that's it's been a while since I read the paper.
They don't carry their own gear. They make money by carrying yours.
Yes.
So they just have a coat, and if the going gets tough, that's the way they'll sleep. They'll just go down into a child posture in yoga and then drape themselves with their coat.
Wow.
Tough
Yeah.
living.
Yeah, it is. Wow. Okay, great. So that's a little bit on the archetypal postures, but you've also more recently started to model how the arms fit into this and brachiation. So do you want to give us a little teaser on that?
For, again, quite some years, probably the last 10 years, I've always had ropes up in the home. Our home is on 3 floors, and we've got ropes on every floor now. Because I reasoned that if I was putting an ape inside a room, I'd give it a rope at least, if nothing.
Yeah.
But gradually I started to see the importance of this as for the upper limb. It's as important as the floor sitting is for the lower limb. And one of the key facts here was the separation about 30 million years ago, the divergence between the monkeys and the apes.
Yeah.
The last common ancestors somewhere back in that time frame. The monkeys stayed small, and smaller brains, smaller social circles. They kept their tails, and they tend to run along the tops of branches.
Yeah.
And the apes went another way. They got bigger, quite a lot bigger, smarter, larger social circles. They lost their tail, and they tend to suspend. So they have this suspensory behavior.
Yeah.
Climbing and pulling themselves up with their arms, hanging on with their arms as they scurry along branches. That's safer than putting your whole body weight on a branch and walking out away from the trunk.
Yeah, it makes sense.
If you're 40 kilos and that starts to give way, 50 kilos, that it can be over quickly. Whereas if you're bending yourself, you can take one arm out further away from the trunk and test it. So we've been elongating our bodies, the apes, for 30 million years. That's why we probably became bipedal, because of this long pre-adaptation to an elongated body form. Using the tail, using those tail muscles to reinforce the pelvic floor. And so I started to see that swinging and hanging, and I've developed a whole series of exercises around swinging and hanging and twisting and turning, are profound for you. In a sense, that even predates the sitting postures, because it goes
Yeah.
back to the origin of apes, not humans.
Yeah. It makes sense. I remember hearing Dan Lieberman speak, the Harvard professor of evolutionary biology. And so he was addressing this conference and he said, you know, looking out on the audience here, I can tell this is a very unusual group of primates. And everyone's kind of waiting, for the punchline. He said, because I bet if I were to ask any one of you, none of you have spent time in a tree in the last 24 hours. And that, for a primate, is very unusual. And, he was just making the point that, we've adapted to do something different, but that obviously our primate ancestry was all about that, all about hanging from branches and being in trees,
Totally. Look, I'm sitting here in this room, but if a big cat came into this room, and this was serious, my adrenaline would go absolutely berserk, and I would look for the highest thing I could to get onto. So you can poke down at a big animal, whereas if
right.
you're looking eye to eye at a big cat or a big dog, that's not a good look.
No, definitely not. Oh, great stuff. So, switching back to the Meridial Map. Now, one of the things that I have always appreciated about the way you teach is that you go deep into the evolutionary biology, like we've just sort of touched on there. But you also talk about the embryological anatomy, and I just wanted to, ask a little bit of a generic question around that, because one of the things that I've come to realize, having heard you speak and hearing others speak about, most other people I've heard speak tend to be focused more towards the evolutionary anatomy, which of course is highly valuable. But you've really studied the embryology in a way that I've never heard anyone else explain it. And you're really coming to it from that idea of the meridial map and movement, and how the development of the individual is going to inform us of the function of the way the body has developed. What was it that kind of led you into that study? Because you've studied that in some depth, haven't you?
I have. I'm not to degree level. I'm just a layperson interested in it. So I read the textbooks.
Yeah.
Embryology is a fantastic way of putting yourself to sleep.
Yes.
It's so arcane, and the language is so dense, and the
Sure.
3D morphing is really hard to get your head around. I would suggest, if you haven't read some embryology, you just don't get it.
Yeah.
So if you come up with ideas, the ideas have got to be, as far as possible, congruent with embryology and congruent with evolutionary biology. Otherwise, it's just whistling in the wind. So, for example, when your limb buds are forming, your limb buds form on a very enigmatic structure. It's only there in the embryo for a few days. Encircles the whole embryo. It's called the Wolffian ridge, because a guy Wolf first described it. And your arms and legs form on this ridge. As the lower limb forms, it goes through a profound internal twist, so that the front of the leg, the quadriceps, is derived from your back body, and your hamstrings are derived from your front body. And so if you just try and run lines directly down the front of the body and then down the quads, you're, without showing that there's been a profound twist there, it's just wrong.
Yeah.
There's no other ways of doing it. So you've got to use embryology, and you've got to use those insights and try and, in a way, work out how to model this stuff.
Yeah.
And contractile fields are, it's a beautiful model. I still think, I published this in 2010, Muscles and Meridians, a book. I think it's still the best model there is out there. It's the only model of human movement that is whole organism in scope, meaning every field I describe has to go from your sensory platform down to your pelvic floor.
Yeah.
In a sense, cranial nerve 1, the nose, leads the whole game, and it has done in vertebrates for the last 500 million years.
Yep.
And then your feet aren't the bottom of you, your pelvic floor is. So every field, like a magnet, has to go from the north to the south. So from the sensory platform down to the pelvic floor. One of the big advantages of my model is that I put the limbs in a bit later in the modeling process.
Right.
Most people go wrong because they try and immediately just look at an adult human and start trying to place lines that go from the torso into the limbs.
Yes.
I would suggest you can be a very good vertebrate, like a snake, and you don't have limbs. You've got the same neuroarchitecture, you've got the same dorsal muscles in large part. You don't have the limbs. Or you can be afflicted by thalidomide, something like that, a terrible drug that that disrupted limb development in children. So you've got a great person there, unfortunately without limbs. But they still move, and this is where Serge Grakovetsky's work was so good. He was
exactly
people move with the same movement patterns that we move in. So that's why contractile fields, for a number of reasons, are I think they're a step change in theory of trying to understand, trying to probe deeper into how and why we move the way we do.
And just for people that aren't familiar with Serge Grakovetsky's work, first of all, it was called the spinal engine, wasn't it? And his whole approach was informed by, again, studying the evolution and looking at the evolution of the spine and showing that the spine is the generator of motion in fish, of course, because they don't have limbs. So of course they have pectoral and pelvic fins, but they don't have limbs in the same way that we do. So the motion is generated by the spine, and that's continued into lizards. And of course the limbs that emerge there amplify the movement of the spine. And he's really, of course, then pointing out that our limbs do the same thing. They amplify the movements of our spine. But, my experience, and, I think most people's experience of if you study the way someone moves and you try and get a gait analysis book, then it's all about feet, and it's all about maybe you might get a bit about the legs, you get relatively little about the trunk. And even if there is stuff about the trunk, it's generally, glossed over with very little detail. But it's almost like they've got everything upside down.
I'd agree.
Yeah.
And I suggest if you don't understand these archetypal postures, your gait patterns are profoundly affected by them. If you're stiff in these archetypal postures, it goes right through into your gait patterns. Try and change gait patterns without changing your biomechanical homeostasis or balance, tune. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's like telling someone to stand up straight. They do it for about 2 seconds and then they go back to their habitual posture.
Yes. So
Serge really took the game ahead.
He did. Yeah, amazing man. Now you mentioned the Wolffian Ridge. That has a similar, or rather a synonym, which is the apical ectodermal ridge, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yep, ectodermal ridge, ectodermal ring.
Yeah. And one of the things I find fascinating about this, and this is I think largely through your insights, is that of course what it does is it forms the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, all the special sensory tissue around the face, and then the nipple line, and the genital tip, so the penis or the clitoris, and then obviously the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. And so this is all special sensory tissue. And what struck me about that is that the model of the reptilian reflexes, which I think you've probably heard of, the idea that you've got your sort of first reptilian reflex being safety and security, and your second reptilian reflex being nutrition, so finding food. and the third being sex. And really, that apical ectodermal ridge is all about all of those three things. So the idea of the reptilian reflexes is that you will, from a behavioral perspective, you will go through each of those in sequence. If you're not safe, you're not interested in food or in sex. And if you're not safe and fed, then you're not interested in sex. Food is your priority. But so the apical ectodermal ridge is all about being able to sense danger, to smell danger, see it, hear it, and then provide you with a means to get away from the danger, which is, of course, again, using those senses, but also using the palms of your hands, if you're a quadruped, and the soles of your feet to get away from the danger and make yourself safe. And then, of course, the second reptilian reflex, which is to find food, is, again, you need special senses to do that. You need to be able to see that the apples are ripe, so it's worth climbing the tree to get them. And then when you pick up the apple and you smell it, it smells good, then you know that you're ready to bite it. And then when you bite it and it tastes sour, you think, oh, that's not good. Maybe that's not an apple. Maybe that's toxic. But if it tastes sweet, then you bring it into you, incorporate it. And so then at that point, if you're then fed, then the next thing is you need to find a mate. So you need to see the mate, you need to smell the mate, you need to perhaps talk to the mate, whatever it is in this day and age. And then you need to move towards the prospective mate. And then, of course, finally, that genital tip and the nipple line and everything comes into play. And all of those special senses that were formed by that apical ectodermal ridge are all sort of, let's say, you realize their potential.
Yep, that's one take on it.
Yeah, one take. Go on, have you got other insights on it?
I just think it's been vertebrates go back more than 500 million years. Once the body plan of a vertebrate was established that long ago, it's been remarkably stable ever since. And the Wolffian Ridge seems to be an information superhighway.
Yeah.
In fish, it's called the fin line or the fin fold. So something quite analogous goes right back to fish.
Yeah.
And so it's a way of linking together in early embryology these fairly separate modules of development into a cohesive unity in a whole organism. So you've got eyes, ears, nose, hands, feet, genitals, all networking in real time to form a viable embryo. So it's in a sense, it goes right back to the beginning of our heritage as a fish.
Yeah. As a vertebrate, yeah. But so this Wolffian Ridge also links in with barefoot running, and I think, well, I know you were the first person to even suggest to me as a student and as the whole class that the foot has evolved to be barefoot, which, of course, in this day and age, having been through this kind of period where there's been minimalist shoes available and the discussions become more of a public discussion, that seems like quite a logical thing. But back in the 90s, that was quite radical. But you were even more radical than that. You actually went barefoot running, right? And so I know you and I went for a couple of runs up in Hampstead. So you had a trail that you knew was relatively safe to go barefoot running. And so tell me a bit more about that. Was it just purely an intuition and sort of rationalizing out the sort of evolutionary path that we had taken?
It was partly that. Between contractile fields and archetypal postures, I had quite a rich model, and the model acts a bit like a treasure map. In science, they say that's what models are. They're theory-driven treasure maps. And the model was showing me how important feet were to a bipedal species like us. I was also seeing a lot of very dysfunctional feet that have grown, right from early days of walking, they've had shoes and socks on. And then in Britain, where it's cold and wet so much of the year, people rarely take their shoes off and go outside. So, and the only way to really improve, or the fastest way to improve feet, was to take your shoes and socks off and start going on some rough terrain. Start to use your plantar fascia in the way that it's really been designed to be used. A bit of rubbing wasn't going to do it.
Yeah.
And so that led to barefoot walking, running. My exercise of choice here in Wellington is to barefoot run on some of the paths up into the hills and then go to a children's playground and play around on there for half an hour and then come home.
Yeah, excellent.
Feel great.
Fantastic. And I remember I think you and I had a conversation one time. We Skyped to just have a bit of a catch up, and you were saying to me, isn't it amazing, Matt, that when you look at the sole of the foot, then it's innervated by the L4, L5, and S1 nerve root, which is exactly where the information needs to be transferred, so you can stabilize that kind of junctional area where the spine is at its most vulnerable. And I've kind of spoken a fair bit about this and looked into it because of my involvement with Vibram Five Fingers between 2007 and 2017. And of course, one of the things when you look into back pain is that 98% of low back pain occurs at L4, L5, and S1. So there's very segments that the nerves from the feet feed back into. And it was you that pointed that out to me, so I want to credit you. But it was just an amazing insight, and it's so obvious when you see it that the soles of our feet are designed to provide that information. So it's just an amazing design.
I call it a data stream, an enormous data stream in real time, directly into those most vulnerable segments, telling those vulnerable segments how to sit on each other.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you run barefoot, you run more carefully, you run more lightly. There's a lot more variability, and biology loves variability. That led me on to the importance of dorsiflexion.
Right.
I've had a T-shirt made that says "In praise of dorsiflexion."
Excellent.
And another one, "For the love of dorsiflexion." It's dorsiflexion is when you bring your foot back up towards your shin. And I started to see how important that angle was. Our species has hit a delicate balance there between climbing and walking and running. So we mostly walk and run, but if we need to, we can scamper up a tree. And dorsiflexion is that angle. That's why barefoot restores your God-given dorsiflexion.
Yes.
The normal training shoe, you've got a positive lift at the back there, and you're really mucking with a key biomechanical angle, in my opinion.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. And we saw that a lot when people transitioned from their traditional running shoes into a more minimalist shoe. A lot of people experienced discomfort in their Achilles tendon for that very reason, that they're stretching it further to get the foot further into dorsiflexion. Of course, there is the whole thing that if you're running around barefoot or in a shoe that has no cushioning, then you're much more likely to forefoot strike, and so you load the Achilles tendon more as well. But I think one of the key benefits, as you say, is increasing that range of motion through the Achilles tendon to allow more dorsiflexion. Yeah. So I know you mentioned briefly the sensory organs earlier and how they are embedded within these contractile fields. Can you just elaborate a touch on that, just so that people understand what you mean by that and how they would relate to these muscular contractile fields that you've described?
Well, it's a bit of a long story. I was developing the model of contractile fields. This is all, in those days, it was very tentative stuff, reaching out into the unknown, trying to put together this model.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I was starting to see what the Chinese were mapping. And one of the things that came out with Meridians, I started to see how they were running meridians from particular parts of the body to particular sense organs. And so in a sense, the Chinese said, well, why don't you think about putting a sense organ as embedded in a particular field of movement? And I realized that this was a valid thing to do, because for 500 million years, the neuroarchitecture of vertebrates has always placed the same cranial nerves in a fish are the cranial nerves we use.
Yes. Yeah.
So, well, we've got two extra. We've got a tongue that moves, and what else? We've got a sternocleidoid. See, fish don't have a neck per se.
Yes. Yes. Right.
That came later. Yeah, but the other 10 are the same. So it means that as bodies have morphed and morphed and morphed over 500 million years, from a fish-type ancestor to an upright bipedal ape, the basic neuroarchitecture has stayed the same. So that I do think that the very early forms of sense organs set up the Christian cross. They set up a front, a back, a left, a right, a top, a bottom. And the sense organs are like beacons that help this basic patterning that sets up very early in embryology. So in your ventrodorsal field, your body's ability to move forwards and backwards, I place your nose. In your body's ability to bend left and right like a fish, I place your ear organs. In your body's ability to talk, to twist, I'll place your eyes. In your body's ability to squeeze, I'll place your mouth and your anus. And so on and so on. It's in the limbs, the limb fields that I described, the sense organs are the hands and the feet.
Right. Yes. Yes.
It's just, it's, in a sense, it's thinking out loud. In a sense, it's trying to come up with, if we're going to understand movement, we have to break down what I call tissue fascism.
Yes. Yeah.
And, for example, I'm very interested in fascia, and I go to the conferences and so on, but I don't want to be a tissue fascist and say that fascia is the thing.
Yes.
It's another tissue.
Nice play on words.
I don't, a tissue fascist or all that sort of thing.
Yeah. So, Phil, can you just explain a bit more about why fields is a good term for these contractile elements that we colloquially know as muscles?
Well, the word field is not tissue specific.
Yeah,
that's why I liked it. It's not neuromuscular. It's not neuromyofascial. I don't want to make the word. That's not the way to think about this stuff. It's a whole. I think we need to keep coming back to a whole organism perspective. The word fields get bigger, they get smaller, fields die, they can eventually go. The fields interact with each other, and that interaction is, in a sense, one of their most powerful attributes. So the field,
I guess they have boundaries and borders as well, don't they?
Boundaries, borders. So my model is all about boundaries and borders. I state very clearly in my book, and now that the breaking up of the body into these fields, which once I talk you through them, most people go, well, why didn't I think of that? It sort of becomes obvious. But doing this is primarily for our intellectual pleasure. Because in the real world, the fields are totally interactive.
Yeah.
And that's the most important thing by far. So we can look at fields, but if I stand up from the floor here, I'm using all of my fields.
Yes.
Go for a walk or a run or a lift or anything. The fields are totally and utterly enmeshed deeply in each other.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I'm not sure if that leads into, the sort of fourth area that we had discussed that we would cover, which is the idea of analogy and metaphor. I mean, I guess you could call them fields from a metaphorical perspective and an analogous perspective, but I guess that, I don't know, are they literally fields?
What I don't quite get that question.
Well,
It's,
yeah, sorry. So what I'm trying to convey is that, you've called these contractile fields, you've used the term fields, but that's really an analogy or a metaphor, I guess, as opposed to a literal interpretation of what they are. Like you said, they all interact. And, one of the things that I know you've been particularly giving thought to over the last few years is this idea of analogy and metaphor and how that can be utilized in teaching and in clinical practice.
yeah.
So I was wondering if you could expand on that.
It comes in part out of my many years teaching osteopathic technique. And if you're teaching technique, you teach a thing. This is how you do something to the wrist. These are techniques for the knee. These are techniques for doing something to a named muscle.
Yeah.
I've found as these ideas came into my life, as they started to affect my manual therapy, very quickly in the real world, I go into freestyle when I treat people. And it's in a way difficult to teach. That's what I do. So I started to become to see the importance of language and the importance of analogy and metaphor in the whole way the human brain is put together. So I started to teach manual therapy based on analogy and metaphor rather than based on applied anatomy. And so that way, if I teach one of these analogies or metaphors, you can go back to your practice on Monday and you can use your existing techniques, but you think about them differently because you're using a different metaphor. And there's so many manual techniques out there, so many styles. And who knows what's better in brackets than another.
Sure.
It's a very hard game to say my work is better than your work, or that sort of thing. It's such a complicated thing. But for example, if I use one metaphor, it's a little bit rough. I call it the kebab technique.
Right. Yes.
If someone comes in with an acute left shoulder, I'll put them lying on their right side, right shoulder in the beginning. That lets I bring the problem up to the surface where I can touch it, move it, palpate it, and then I'll do whatever I want to do there. And you can treat this any way you want using your current practice. You then put the person on the left side, and then you palpate the shoulder while it's down. You get totally different information. And then the person's on their left, and then then the person is on their back, then the person is on their front, and you can add some twist into there. Each posture brings up a different part of that condition.
And that's through the sort of stresses that places through the contractile fields?
Yes, through the whole network.
Organism. Yeah.
It's just the whole organism. So it doesn't matter if you're doing cranial work or muscle energy technique or any form of, I don't care, whatever you do. Just by putting people quite consciously in the round.
Yeah.
Back, left, right, put on some twists, then you're going to get better results. Rather than just do whatever you're going to do on the shoulder and say, right, that's it.
Yes. And was this way of explaining things, do you think that was influenced at all by your traditional Chinese medicine training? Because one of the things I've noticed, certainly about the sort of elements and the way the Chinese talk about the elements, is that, of course, they're not talking about literal fire in the body or earth in the body. They're using metaphor to explain a much more complex topic. and subject area that's far more vast than the metaphors they're placing onto it. Do you think your idea of utilizing analogy and metaphor might have been sort of stimulated by any of that, or is it just completely different origin that it came from?
I don't really know, Matt. It just gradually, I gradually started to see the importance of using analogies and metaphors, and how analogies don't prove anything, but they aid what they call high level perception.
Right.
So they just help you think about something. It helps bridge from something you know about to something you don't know about.
Yes. So kind of making some order from the chaos, essentially.
One of the ones I like is in the 2008 stock market crash. This was unexpected, and the world's economics people didn't know what to do. They hadn't modeled this, a crash that big. New Science magazine came out and said, the world economy, treat it like a polluted swamp. And so suddenly, we've got fair ideas about how to treat a polluted swamp. You've got great drainage, you've got to plant special things. There's ways of doing it. And you could start to look at the economy and apply those patterns. And in fact, that way of thinking proved to be very powerful. In helping mitigate and us getting over that crisis.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. One remaining question that I had for you, if you feel like we've reached the end of our discussion for today, because I think we're an hour in now. So what I wanted to ask you is, where do you feel the world of musculoskeletal medicine could do with some redirection? And I think obviously we've just discussed that over the last hour, but would there be any advice that you would offer, perhaps to an aspiring researcher or to someone, who's running a college or whatever, where do you think things have gone off track, and how can we redirect them based on your understanding of the human body?
Well, first of all, it's much better to prevent rather than try and treat afterwards. So let kids, don't put them into shoes too early. Let them sit on the floor to do their homework, all that sort of thing. And let it go on as long as you possibly can. I call it placing a value on floor life. I would like to see offices around the world with big ropes slung right across the office space. So when you're not at your computer, you can just get both of your arms up.
And is the idea there that you literally swing from the ropes, or you hang from the ropes, or you just put your arms up above your head?
I think you get 80% of the goodness just by getting your arms above your head.
Well, do you know what, Phil? One really interesting thing about that is that the Football Association here in the UK, because of course these footballers are such high commodities now, high value commodities, they invested, I don't know the amount, but it was at least hundreds of thousands of pounds into research to understand better how the footballers could recover quicker, because of course the game is very sort of high level, or it's using the anaerobic energy systems, so that the players can fatigue, they're at greater risk of injury, the game's not as entertaining when they're fatigued, etc. So the big question was, how do we recover quicker? And what they established, across all of this sort of expenditure, was that the very best thing the players could do was put their hands above their heads, literally walk around with their hands on their heads to recover. And so it's kind of interesting that it ties in with your brachiation theories.
You've got no idea how profound getting your arms up, particularly then doing a bit of hanging, is for your low back.
Yes. Yeah.
If I hang by my arms, and even with my feet on the floor, but I just bend my knees, I'm putting a 40 or 50 kg pull through my low back. If I tried to pull you on the table at 40 or 50 kgs, I'd just pull you off the table.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So you're able to, by getting your arms above your head and bending your knees and so on, you're able to really help your system in quite a profound way. So I think that we've got we've got to design a new table that's being produced here in New Zealand called the LIMBER, LIMBER table. It's a fantastic table. It's it goes from the floor to sitting to standing.
Right.
That's something that we need to get into offices around the world. We've got to get a, a floor life that transitions seamlessly into a conventional sitting life and then seamlessly into a standing life, because
Yeah.
that's what your physique wants. And so this table goes from the floor to full height, standing height, in less than 2 seconds.
Oh, wow.
So you can, yeah, it's a really nice piece of design.
Amazing. Well, and I think you're aware that I recently wrote a paper with Mark Sisson, the Primal Blueprint guy, and I obviously brought in your archetypal postures concept to that paper, and part of the reason that we discussed that is partly because he's into his primal work and discussion of that whole primal lifestyle, but I had found a paper within the Journal of Bodywork that I was writing for, which was talking about how stretching, and in particular passive stretching, helps to regulate blood sugar control. And it was just fascinating because it led down a kind of rabbit hole of multiple research papers that all show the same thing. And it seems like a kind of passive stretch is more effective than an active stretch at optimizing blood sugar control. And of course, the archetypal rest postures are arguably passive because you're just sat there still and gravity is doing the stretching, right?
Gravity's work with
That's yeah.
Mm.
It's amazing, isn't it, that these mechanisms are built into us and we're negating them by sitting in a chair all day long.
Yeah. What I like about this part of my work is that it's really cost-free. It's, again, they're ideas that come from the model.
Yes.
To spend more time on the floor costs you nothing, basically. In fact,
Yeah.
you don't have to buy the sofa.
Yes.
Sell the sofa and put the money in the bank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't have to pay for the osteopathic treatment.
I watch here in modern cities, in offices, you get the ergonomics consultant coming in for some hundreds of dollars per hour. And they get your computer and they take it 2 degrees this way and your chair goes up another centimeter. I think it's rubbish.
Yeah, I agree.
What your system really wants is, in a sense, an unergonomic, uncomfortable office life
Yeah.
where you've got to get up and down
Yes.
a lot. It's those micro movements that keep you going.
Yeah, it smacks to me of a just complete misunderstanding of how the nervous system works, because quite clearly you don't have to study the nervous system in too much depth, and you start to understand that the nervous system is designed to move us, and that the moment we start to get creep on our tissues, our nervous system is being bombarded with messages asking you to move. So, why just try and create one posture that creates the best optimal angles when really we just should be moving postures the whole time?
Totally. And putting big ropes up across office spaces, it's a really cheap but powerful intervention into helping people get through their working day.
Yeah. Now, I know in your own home you have, let's say, modified your kitchen floor. Would you recommend that to other people as well? Is that something that people can be doing to help minimize risk of injury and optimize function?
And we converted our kitchen floor into a rough stone mat. And some of the stones were so sharp I had to draw red nail polish on them because they could draw blood if you were too clumsy. And we had that for about 4 years. We've got rid of it now because we've got access to the great New Zealand outdoors.
Fantastic, yeah.
But that was an attempt to show that in big cities like London or Paris, where it's cold and wet a lot of the year, it's not cool, to walk around barefoot.
Yeah.
We have to bring that outside life inside. And so that was an attempt to do that. My wife, after 3 months, said, "Phill, look at this." and her shoulders had come down. That was the first thing she really noticed. The shoulders had come down. And that,
Wow.
if you're not comfortable on your feet, you hold yourself up with your trapezius and, your upper girdle. That's the way it works. The more I do this business, the less difference I see between arms and legs.
Right.
They're so fully networked into each other.
Yes. So Phill, that's been fantastic. Lots of amazing insights as usual. Now, if people want to find out more about these kinds of insights, I know you've got your book out, Muscles and Meridians, The Manipulation of Shape. Where can people get hold of that?
It's becoming hard to get. You can go directly to Elsevier. Some copies on Amazon. You just have to look around for it. It's a difficult read, but it's all the ideas are in there.
Yeah, fantastic. And do you have? I know you've got a website. What do you have on the site?
phillipbeach.com. I don't have very much. It's a brief outline about the fields and my 2, 3, 4, 5-day courses that I run. So that's and I try to keep up to date with where I'm teaching.
Excellent. And I know you also wrote 3 papers for the Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapies, which I know a lot of people will be able to access. I think if you're an osteopath, then certainly you can download those as part of your General Osteopathic Council membership or your whoever your governing body is. So that those should be accessible, I imagine, still. But yeah, that's fantastic, Phill. Thanks so much for that. And I will look forward to seeing you in March, because we're putting on a workshop, right?
I look forward to seeing you then, and that would be the place to meet us both and spend more time doing this properly.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much for your time, Phill.
Thank you,
Speak
Matt.
soon.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. So, there's just a glimpse of Phil's incredible insights into human function, and I'm sure that's got your mind racing off in multiple directions. Of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg, as I'm sure you'll appreciate it's quite a challenge to convey a lifetime of exploration into an hour of podcast. If you love that and know others who would enjoy Phil's insights, please feel free to pass it on and share the love. Phill and I are putting on a 2-day workshop in Wellington, New Zealand on March the 5th and 6th, where we'll dive much deeper into the practical applications of this way of viewing the human body, looking at the interactions of the neurodevelopmental process infants go through, which of course mimics the evolutionary process, to prepare them for life as a fully functional bipedal human being. Immediately following this, I'll be holding a 2-day seminar in Auckland and then in Sydney, applying a similar modelling to the field of persistent pain. So if you're near enough to join us and would like to explore this further, you can secure your place or get more details from mattwallden.com. Hope to see you there. Thanks for listening to the show.